I think the bright light is the signal to begin, so we'll go ahead and do it. So we're going to talk about using your IR team, your incident response team, for something other than firemen and maids. And we're going to get into exactly what that is, what are firemen and maids, and what are we talking about here. First of all, my name is Wade Baker. We both work for Verizon. We've taken the Verizon logos off from this point forward, so we won't bug you with that. But this is some things that we've been working on, both in our work life and in our non-Verizon life as well.
And my name's Chris Porter. I work for Wade, and so we're hoping to give you a nice little entertaining afternoon, and hopefully finish up and go find the beers here soon as well. So what's the standard IR practice? I think the IR practice really hasn't changed all that much since the NIST report that came out several years ago. I think it's like NIST 861 or something like that. And so I'm going to kind of walk through that process as they put out. So one of the first things in the IR process is that preparation phase. A lot of this has to do with the policies. You create your IR procedures. You set up a team within your organization. You do training. One thing that we talk about also with training is practice. Are we talking about practice? If you guys get the Allen Iverson quote from several years in the past. But we've noticed, in this whole preparation phase that there's been a lot of deficiencies in organizations. Many organizations don't have these policies and procedures. They don't have a team, that sort of thing. That is not the point of this talk. We're just kind of walking through the piece of this as we're kind of going forward. So this isn't the kind of the focus of our presentation today, though. The other piece is detection and analysis. So, these are the ways that organizations, use to help identify that an incident has taken place within their organization. There's a combination of, people, process, technologies to gain some sort of visibility that there's an incident that's taking place. Sometimes when it's taking place, sometimes you don't. If you walk over to the RSA hall, there's plenty of myriads of products over there. There's trying to sell you something to help you gain this visibility, help you identify that there's these the detection and analysis sorts of things. A lot of money is spent on this piece. But we see a lot of deficiencies in this area as well. Most breaches, for instance, that we've studied as part of our data breach reports, third parties are telling them that these breaches have taken place. So a lot of space here. There can be an entire presentation on this part. That's not part of our presentation today either, though. So the containment phase. This is where I think most IR people spend most of their time. This is kind of the firefighting phase. It's Friday afternoon. It's closing time. You're getting ready to go grab beers, and you're going to head off to the ball game later that night. And then all of a sudden, your mobile device, it used to be a beeper several years ago. Now it's probably an alert to your iPhone. There's a DDoS attack. All your web servers are down. And so you're there spending the weekend trying to get all these systems back up and running when, you'd like to go about your regular business. In the IR team, if there's a malware, outbreak in the organization, you're trying to contain it and keep it from going to your European operations, et cetera, that sorts of thing. So we've also studied this. There's a section in our report that we talk about, breach discovery methods and a specific measurement and how quickly organizations can contain these things. And sadly, it's an area that needs a lot of work as well. And then lastly, or not lastly, but almost to the last, is that you have your Maids part of the IR operation. So you've got this incident, you've contained it, now you have to clean up this mess. You got to make sure that the systems are no longer infected. You got to clean everything up. It may be like taking things down completely and rebuilding from scratch. Sometimes you can never really get them all cleaned up, and these remnants of those incidents are there within your organization. And then lastly, you've got this lessons learned piece. This is what we're really going to be focusing on this afternoon. This is the retrospective of what happened during the incident. The report that spells out the who, the what, when, where, how, and why kind of things, the improvements that can be made to the organization, the processes and procedures that can be improved, that sort of thing. How many IR folks do we have out in the audience right now? Quick show of hands, like when you guys do an incident, how many have this lessons learned phase at the end of it?
They're going to disprove us.
They're going to disprove us. All right, we're gonna go grab beers now. We'll see you guys later. Well, sadly, what we find happens is that it's not a true lessons learned, but rather it's a description documented of the incident. It doesn't go through the process of trying to find the improvements that can be made to the organization, but rather it's it's more of a CYA exercise or maybe just a documentation exercise. But the true lessons learned from the incident kind of disappear. And if there is a report that's done, it typically will disappear into a shelf somewhere, or out into the ether, into a file server, never to be found again, hidden in the abyss of your organization, hanging out with all the other lessons learned that could have been learned.
All right. So we've talked about this firemen and maids cleaning things up. We've talked about the problems that exist and really taking these incidents that occur and using your IR team to build some lessons learned. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the other side of the house, on the security decision-making process. So every organization makes security decisions. You have people that figure out what you're going to spend your money on. Right? They're going to figure out what to do. They prioritize which threats or risks are most important to you, which ones need to be addressed, which ones can wait till next year, how you're going to go about doing that. They spend an incredible amount of time, right? And my experience, there's some ways that typically happens, but it does not have data in it usually, right? It's usually utterly lacking in any kind of real evidence or real data. I have done some studies on this. I've been working on it for several years, actually, and this is my 6 bullet point list on how 90-something% of security decisions are made. You can tell me afterwards if you disagree. So there's the adamant auditor. This is probably one of the most important ones or most common ones. The auditor shows up. A lot of times they have no security experience. They're fresh out of college. They have this checklist, right? That's like it was written in stone. And if you don't meet everything on this checklist exactly as it's written down, you're done. And you can't convince the guy that hey, this control right here, we're already doing that. It looks a little bit different, but it's accomplishing the same thing, right? It has equal value. We can't check this off, so you fail. So this adamant auditor is responsible for a phenomenal amount of our security decisions. We just do it because we don't have any way to argue against them, and it's not worth it to argue because we're going to lose anyway. So that's number one. Peer pressure, another big one. This is kind of like the grown-up version of doing what the cool kids do. Right, you hear that your peer organizations A, B, and C are doing this new fancy gizmo control practice, whatever it is, and well, why not? We should do it because they're like us, and we want to be like them, and that we don't want to be embarrassed if they do it, and something happens to us, we would look bad, like we don't care, so we'll do it. Of course, the problem with that is maybe they make fantastic decisions. Probably they don't. They're probably making their decisions exactly like you are. So this is just iterating down the chain of events to where people are following other people who are following other people, and nobody's really making a decision that makes sense many times. Wibbehe, anybody heard of this? All right, so this one is incredibly common. This was the favorite of the executives out there. Wouldn't it be horrible if is the beginning of a justification that's going to waste a lot of money and time and effort, right? So think of some awful scenario that could go wrong if planets aligned and all of these kinds of things. Box that up as what we're worried about, and we're going to do all of these things because we're worried about that thing happening, and it would be so terrible. It would be a business-ending event, and we'd all have to, be in jail, and it would be terrible. So that is a very common justification, right? It's this fear-based, scary thing. Focuses on impact more than it does frequency. We need both of them. So guru guidance is another incredibly common one. Every business has these smart guys that walk around. They all have opinions. And you just say, hey, what do you think we should do? Should we do A or B? And they give you their opinion, and you just do it because they're smart and they're right a lot of times, and I don't have any other better ideas. Poll the panel is kind of a version of that, except maybe you use several gurus. This is Delphi method sometimes, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but you just get a bunch of people together. Maybe it's in a boardroom, and you all, I don't know what you do. You play cards or something like that, and you come to a decision, and that's what we're going to do. You kind of get the, I don't know. And then the pet project. This is an issue, too. So the boss reads something in a magazine about this new thing, or they read the analyst report about it, or they see it out on the RSA floor, and they come back, and they're shoving it in your face and saying, hey, we're doing this because it's important. And you say, yeah, but what is it? I don't know, we're doing it because it's good. Trust me, right? So this, and you cannot convince them that that's not worth doing, so you just might as well do it. So a lot of these things, I realize, are pretty tongue-in-cheek, but seriously, does anybody think that we don't make a ton of security decisions on this whole notion of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? This drives a very large proportion. Maybe your organization is not like this, I hope not. But again, the ones that I've worked with, those tend to be the most common ones. It would make a lot more sense if we use data to drive our decisions. If we could base a little bit more of our security decision-making process on data. This guy would look really confident holding this data thing, and he could make his decisions and do all the stuff that he needs to do.
So where are we going to get this sort of data within organizations? It's one of the biggest problems that we think our industry in general kind of faces, is this sort of lack of data, lack of meaning of that data as well. And so we're going to kind of take something from Doug Hubbard here about kind of finding that sort of data. So this is all part of his book of, how to measure anything. You've got, your problem isn't as unique as you think. All organizations have this problem, this lack of data. You have a lot more data than you can think, and we're gonna get into that here a little bit more. You need less of it in order to make these decisions. You don't need to have perfect information. You can allow a certain amount of uncertainty in your information and still gain meaning from it. And there's a lot of simple measurements that can be made out of this. So going to kind of steal something from Bill Parcells, a Hall of Fame football player. You are what your record says you are. That's one of the biggest indicators of like a football team, for instance, is how many wins they have, how many losses they have, and who they are as a football team is it's really about the record. If you're 8-8, you're not a playoff team, for instance. Well, kind of play off that a little bit is you are what your incident record says you are. Incidents within your organization are one of the #1 ways that you can really find out how your information security program is going. At its root, an incident is some type of failure. It tells you about your threats. It tells you about your losses, how you've dealt with them, how quickly you've dealt with them. It's a true outcome-based measurement of your program. But we've got this problem. We talked a little bit about our firemen and maids earlier, our IR team, and then we've got this other part of the organization who make these security decisions, and there's this there's this wall between them. They're not at the same table when these decisions are made. And so this information never crosses over to the decision makers, this sort of evidence or intelligence that can be used to make these decisions. And so we say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
All right, let's talk about that. So some of you are probably familiar with the Data Breach Investigations Report. We do this thing every year. There's a group of folks up there who we work a lot with, and we all spend a lot of time on this, and we at least hope it's somewhat worthwhile. If it's not, then my point is really destroyed that I'm trying to make today. So I just want to take a step back from IR teams and responding to incidents and collecting data in your organization. I'm not going through all the reports, so just don't even, I'm not showing you any statistics from the report. Actually, that's one lie. I have one slide on that. What I really want to talk about is what this represents, right? The Data Breach Investigations Report uses as its primary source of information security incidents. And the primary suppliers of that information are incident responders. We have a group of people that show up and they do their engagement, they collect all their evidence, they write a report, and they file that report. Our team gives that report back to the client to say, hey, this is what happened. Now, these guys, we spend our time taking that report, combing through it, and looking at it, analyzing it, and seeing what we can learn from the report to try to do this lessons learned phase that we talked about that was broken. So again, going back to the typical incident report, it's a narrative. It says what happened. It's very good for describing what happened in this security incident. What it's not very good at is helping you count things and create metrics and statistics and do quantitative analysis over time, right? You can't really count that. I guess you could do a word search and count how many times you saw backdoor, but just ignore that for a sec. So what we've done in the data breach report is we treat every incident like this. An incident is a series of events. It's a series of things that occur. And if you broke it down into kind of its smallest parts, right, we're interested in the major phases that occur in this incident. And we try to collect the agent, that's who did it, the action, what that agent did in the incident, the asset that those agents' actions affected, and then how the asset was affected. So we had this 4 A's, we call them agents, action, assets, and attributes. And you can see this same incident, we've vericized it, we've turned it into something that's looking a little bit more like metrics, right? I'm going to get to the point where we get to lessons learned in just a minute. So this first phase, right, here's the incident scenario. This first one is the phishing email, and it's got some malware on it, and you trick somebody to click it. Bang. That's external agent, a social threat action against a people asset. Yes, people have information, and they process and store information, so we treat them as an asset. And the integrity, that's the security attribute of that person's been compromised. You've caused them to do something they wouldn't have done. It changed their behavior. And then there's external malware, user devices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, that this, if you look at this, there's lots of moving parts in this thing, right? There's external agents. There's even an internal guy that commits an error over here. There's hacking and malware and social. Most incident taxonomies that I've seen maybe are one-dimensional, right? They say malware or intrusion or something like that. We apply these things to it rather than, hey, this incident can be thwarted by more than one way, right? I can maybe do some training and awareness on that E1 phase and keep that guy from ever clicking on the email. Maybe I can filter that thing out. Maybe I can, after the backdoor is installed, I see it dial out, beacon home, and I can see that outbound connection that's from a system that's never done that before in that port, and stop that thing. So my point is, there's lots of ways that we can prevent this, and this is what the reason that we're analyzing these, there's lessons learned, right? So if you do that for one incident, you can imagine doing that for 100 incidents, right? Or 855 is what we've done this for in our next breach report, which will be out, a little advertisement here next, not soon, or soon, not far away is what I meant to say. But anyway, you can imagine doing it for 100, right? And we begin to see, hey, how many of our incidents are external versus internal, and how many involve a social engineering aspect versus malware and hacking? How many infect user devices versus servers or other types of offline data? And we're building up this knowledge, this repository of lessons learned of what happened. Now, again, this is something that we've done, right? I like to think that we have proven through these reports that you can take IR data as a primary source and turn it into something that looks, maybe decision makers could find some value out of this, right? That's one of the things that that we've heard is that decision makers like the data breach report because they lay it out, it shows them which threats occur most often. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's some data, right? And it's supposed to improve the decision-making process. So I think we've done that at a community level, incidents that Verizon has responded to, or the Secret Service, or the other people contributing to us. And the question is, really, how can a single organization implement the same type of process, right? Learning from incidents, figuring out lessons learned, and what to do from now. So, you're up.
So how can your organization do this and create a data breach report or an incident report that Wade was just talking about? So one of the first things I think we have to do is define what an incident is. It seems like a rather simple thing at first, but it's one of those things that if you truly want to measure something, you have to strictly define what it is so you can measure it. A lot of organizations, there's a lot of kind of a broad definition of this sort of thing. Many organizations only think of like computer intrusions as being incidents. Some organizations, think about downtime as being an incident, especially if you're some type of retail organization where you want to have constant uptime and you have your customers constantly buying some sorts of things. There's also organizations that count an incident as any IDS alert that comes back, which is a lot of counting because a lot of times those things will include lots of false positives and that sort of thing. So what we want to do is kind of, we have a definition that we use and something that we think is fairly simple. It's an event that compromises a security attribute, the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an information asset. And as Wade talked earlier about the types of assets that we're looking at within an organization, these are all assets. It's the servers, your network devices, your end user devices, your people, offline data as well within your organization. And we're also talking about different threat actions. We're not just talking about hacking and malware sorts of incidents within your organization. We're not talking about even specific threat actors like we only count an incident from China or only activists are an incident, that sort of thing. We also want to have this broad definition of even like environmental threats. If it's a hurricane or a tornado knocks the power down, we want to be able to count that incident as being an availability incident within our organization. The second thing is you got to make sure you have a incident response team. I've purposely kind of subtracted the C here because a lot of times we call this the computer incident response team. Well, we don't mean just computers. We're just not responding to these sorts of electronic incidents, but all sorts of incidents. If it's a document that's gone missing, we want to have that as being a sort of incident that we can collect metrics upon. And you need to have a team from all parts of the organization, even including folks from maybe a disaster recovery team and BCP planning teams, physical security, for instance, as well, and your traditional more computer incident response teams all together as part of this big team. I want you to use Varus. It's free. It gives you a easy way, structured to taking all of those incident narratives and help you count those important elements and be able to compare them amongst other incidents that you have within your organization. Oh, and by the way, again, it's free. So there's nothing, you don't have to pay for it.
So a little bit about what this might look like, right? What exactly are we talking about here? So we want you to take your firemen and your maids, your incident response team. That's not derogatory, by the way. I'm not trying to say that all you incident responders out there are firemen and maids. It's a good thing, right? That's an important job. So anyway, point is, let's get them to do their job after they clean up the mess and put out the fires and do what they do. Document something, and not just document it, but really think about, hey, what exactly happened here? Let's define this. Let's classify this incident so that we can store it in a way that we can learn from it in the future. If you begin to do that, I'll get to this thing in the middle here, you're going to build up a historical knowledge that the decision makers can tap into to make better decisions, right? That's the whole point, is to equip them with what they need, whoever they are, to make better security decisions. Would you rather them do WIBAHE and all that other kind of stuff, right? Hopefully this seems like a little better way to you. This is something that we have done. We show this in the data breach report, but I want to use it inside of one organization right now. So what you're looking at, a lot of organizations just don't even know where to begin, right? When you start talking about threats, they don't have a really good way to classify or organize threats. So how can you start counting things if you don't really have a good organization system? So what you're looking at here is this grid, and there's 4 things on it. They're those 4 A's that I talked about a little while ago. At the top, external, internal, and partner are the 3 main categories of threat agents. Malware, hacking, social misuse, those are all of your threat actions. On the side over here, servers, networks, end user devices, those are your assets. And confidentiality, integrity, availability are the attributes of those assets that you're trying to keep those agents from using their actions against. So this grid represents everything that can happen to your organization. If we've done our job, if you find something that's not in here, that means we need to revise the grid and include it in here. But again, going back to what Chris was saying, there's all kinds of incidents in here. We want everything. All of your environmental stuff that takes out the availabilities of networks and servers, that should be in the same place as your malware and your hacking incidents that affect confidentiality and integrity of your user devices and servers, right? We need this big picture view. It's all important. It all compromises an information asset. That's our job to protect it. And so just to make sure we're all on the same page, top left thing with a 9 in it, ignore the 9 and ignore the yellow right now. That is an incident that involves an external, some type of malicious software that affects the confidentiality of a server. It's hierarchical. You can break it down into what type of malware and who is the external agent and all of that kind of stuff, what type of server. That's another talk for another day. But the 9 means we saw 9 of those things. Again, an incident can have many of these events in one single incident, but we're counting things. So we saw 9 of them. And wow, there's 656. These are results from, it's pretty close to an actual organization. We did a little bit of switching up, but you see things like this when you begin to study incidents in an organization. Obviously, we have something to work on in external malware affecting the confidentiality and integrity of user devices, right? Desktops and laptops and things like that. So the point of doing this, of structuring it in a way that makes sense, is to put some boundaries on your universe of risk that you have to manage as a decision maker, give you some data to drive these decisions. What we're really doing here is starting to diagnose problem areas, things that keep happening, keep plaguing us. This says something is wrong with these areas. We need to do something about them. Or maybe we don't want to do something about them, but we need to know that they exist. Another thing you can begin to do, because it's not all about frequency, right, is to study loss information. And every single one of those, right, if the confidentiality of your end user systems is affected, well, that's going to cause some loss to your organization. Well, what does the loss look like? Is it a few dollars? Is it many? You know, all of these things would have a different loss distribution, theoretically, right? But you can begin to capture that information as well and tie it. And all of a sudden you can know, all right, well, if I'm worried about these types of losses, what types of threat agents cause those losses and what actions trigger those things and which ones are worse, more frequent, all those kinds of questions. The reason we want to do that, again, is to make better decisions. We think by doing that, you'll make wiser policy, procedural, people, process, technology decisions than you would from the adamant auditor, Wibbehe, and poll the audience and all of that other kind of stuff that we talked about at the beginning of this thing. And you can measure things over time. This would be incredible, right? Do any of your organizations, can you tell me, after you implement a control, what happens to your average incident count on a monthly basis? Do you measure the delta of this? Maybe? I see some. But why not? Why don't we do things like this? Everybody says, oh, that's a bunch of crap, that what they're selling out there is not going to work. Well, why don't we prove them wrong or right? Why don't we measure these things? After we do a security change, let's measure, and we should start to see things drop over time, whether it's losses or incidents, right? Yes, maybe it's an outside, maybe the threat environment changed, but that's my point is we can measure how effectively we're using our security money. Okay, what else can you do?
So another thing you can do after you've kind of created this process where you're going back and you're looking at incidents as they come in and you're capturing and measuring and doing these different things, you also have an incredible amount of data in your organization in the abyss, as we mentioned earlier. You can go back into those files, dig up those description reports that we were talking about earlier that are describing incidents and kind of convert them into these sorts of metrics where you can create those measurements over time and look at how your incidents have been over time. Another thing that I think is one of the most important ways of looking at incidents within your organization are your ticketing systems. I mean, how many incident responders or decision makers out in the crowd here use, look at help desk tickets as a measurement of what's going on within your organization. Any hands? It's really bright down here. Yeah, I mean, I think I saw one up there. I think was that Alex Hutton?
Alex Hutton, he's full of
Man, wow, Alex Hutton's here. Man, this is a big day.
Alex did every bit of this, by the way.
Man. But your help desk ticketing system, if you have, I remember as an incident responder working at an organization, 10 or so years ago, there was an outbreak of a brute force piece of malware, and all of a sudden folks across the entire organization were getting locked out of their accounts. Well, we had direct measurements of that happening because everybody was calling the help desk and trying to get their password changed. So help desk ticketing systems, very rich resource for these sorts of things. And then also, another thing, and this is in a very much ideal world, that you have these sorts of decision makers at many organizations kind of following the same process. People within organizations in the same industry, in different industry, each are going to have metrics that look different. There's different threats and different actions that are used against different types of organization. We've seen in the breach report that, for instance, hospitality and retail organizations have a much different looking grid compared to a manufacturing organization or a financial organization. Very different types of attacks, very different types of assets that are affected, different combinations of attributes affected on those assets. So in a perfect world, everybody would be doing this, and you could then use that as a way of sharing information amongst organizations. Verus, for instance, doesn't have any identity in each of the in the metrics. You can capture them for yourself, but if you wanted to share that information, the only part of it that gets shared is, what industry you are, what size is of your organization, and maybe your region that you operate in, and gives a way to kind of look at this sort of comparative data. And then you get this massive grid that you can then compare your results to. So for instance, say, I'm part of some sort of information sharing program. I've got my grid from all the incidents that we've had, and then I also get a grid of my peers in my industry. What will be very interesting is, what's different? Are my peers seeing more hacking and malware events than I am? Well, why is that? Is that because I don't have visibility into my incidents? I don't know they're happening? And that certainly could be the case. Maybe you don't know they're happening. Or maybe you see that if it's broken down even further, you can even compare this with different departments within your organization. If you're one of these much larger corporations that have groups that compete in different industries, you can compare each of those amongst the other organizations.
How do you sell the idea of sharing the information, even stripped out and pseudo-anonymized within your industry? Most likely people, most interesting people are probably your competitors, and if they at least know who it came from, even if everything else has been removed, people are going to get worried about, our competitors, they had 8 times more hacking breaches than we did, or vice versa. So it's very tight-lipped up there.
Certainly, but this type of information sharing happens all the time between competitors right now. I mean, FSISAC, for instance, you've got all these banks who are competing and trying to grab customers, and they're sharing this type of information, and some share more than others. Well, Verus, are they using it?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't know. Yeah, hopefully.
We've talked to them.
We've talked to them.
Yeah, and a lot of that information sharing is unstructured, have a little sip over drinks, what are you seeing, I trust you, it's face-to-face, it won't leave this room, all of that kind of thing.
Or it might be more tactical sort of information, which is within Verus as well as, specific malware indicators or IP addresses, that sort of thing, has a place within the framework as well.
So your question, though, is interesting. You ask what would cause them to want to do it, which is critically important to this whole thing, right? If nobody wants to share information, then it all just crumbles and it's not worth it. So One, again, go back to a single organization. You can do this. You just need buy-in at the top to say, yes, we're going to spend the time on it and begin tracking these things. So there's value that can be had within one organization, again, between departments and other things like that. A lot of organizations have already decided that they want to share information. There's information sharing consortiums. FSISAC is one of them. Multi-state ISAC. There's, they are groups of organizations that are committed to sharing information with each other. Obviously, they don't want to divulge secrets or anything that could put them out. But I think one of the most important things is again, you got to get to the decision makers and show them that this is worthwhile. And we've been trying to do that. I mean, we've been publishing the data breach report for 5 years. This will be the 5th version of it this coming spring. And we're trying to put this data out there and say, hey, this is valuable. This is worth collecting, and we get good feedback on it. So we think there's something to it. You could do this too. Yes, it takes time and effort and all of that, but it's worth doing. And if you share it, it's even more valuable because we'll start building up this knowledge that we all have collectively. And that's maybe that's a pipe dream. It might not work perfectly, but we are seeing institutions that are willing to share that kind of information. And if you followed the sorry, I see your question over there, but if you followed the breach report, the first 2 times we did it, it was just Verizon data, right? We were the only organizations we could convince to share this information. This year when we publish, we've got the United States Secret Service giving us hundreds of incidents classified according to Veris, anonymized and shared. We've got the Dutch National High-Tech Crime Unit. We've got the London Metropolitan Police. We've got the Australian Federal Police and the Irish CERT. So these are organizations, they're governments, we're a private organization, we're sharing across that line. Again, I'm not trying to advertise here, but I'm saying that it can work, right? It works across those lines that people don't like to usually communicate stuff. It works across cultural borders. We're sharing with people in Asia Pacific. And I think there's going to be value in it. This is, well, we got to look at more incidents in 2011 than we ever have in any year. So part of it's a value proposition of, if I'm going to share, what am I going to get from it? Yep.
One comment, 2 questions. You guys should take a bow because this is awesome. My team deployed it for telecom.
Appreciate it.
Second one, your chart is great, but you're missing impact, so you have frequency in it.
So, yes. Now, he's asking, the chart is great, but it's missing impact. That is because the 4 A's represent a threat event, so it actually doesn't have impact. The technical impact, if you want to call it that, would be the intersection of a security attribute, confidentiality and integrity, and an information asset. So if I can say that the confidentiality of this server was compromised, that's a technical description of an impact. And that's going to have some business level consequences depending on what that asset is and how its confidentiality was affected. So there's kind of another grid. We have a different way to look at impact, but they fit together, if you will, at that attribute and asset combo. So you're correct.
Do you have sample somewhere how to put impact in?
Yeah, I don't in this slide, but yeah, maybe we can talk about it afterwards.
So the second question that I had was, in less than a day sitting at RSA, a lot of people keep bringing up security intelligence, threat intelligence. This is the basis of that. Are you guys saying, are you asking to be more involved in Speak up, Phil.
So he's asking about basis of security intelligence. A lot of people at RSA are talking about security intelligence. Are we doing anything with that? Is that what it is?
For all the ISACs, you can try to get this.
Would love to. If anybody is interested in information sharing, we're always into that.
All of the ISACs that deploy this.
I'm going to go around them.
Oh, that's so unlike Alex.
Did you see RSA's booth last year?
Sure.
The one going on about this kind of stuff, about incident responses, and trying to pull some metrics.
I didn't see that actually. No.
So I sat with
I was really proud of that. I wrote the whole thing.
So I sat
So
with
is it working?
You got about 30 minutes after this?
Maybe. Well, no, actually I don't. But I've got 30 minutes tomorrow or some other time.
There's a universal desire to start sharing information. I mean, I sat with Congressman Thornberry yesterday. He's running Senate Bill 2105, and I've got the HR bill, but long story short, they're looking for, Congress is looking for this, DSIE, which is Defense DIB, information sharing, all the ISACs, they're looking for this too.
mean, I'm a big telecom. We're following this. I'm sure Verizon is doing it as well. Obviously, I mean, the more of us that are following the same approach to collecting statistics, we're going to be better off.
Yep, I would agree with that.
And I was gonna, excuse me.
It's all you.
So there's several folks on our team up here, up at hiding in the dark areas up there. But you know, something speaking about intelligence sharing and just understanding a little bit more about threat actors and the type of actions that they have. We're recently getting to a point in maturity in our data to where we can do a lot of pattern matching of these sorts of things. We were at Mini-Metricon yesterday, and Jay Jacobs, one of our new team members, went through and talked about some of the patterns that we've been seeing when you drill down into this grid and see how they interconnect with one another, how malware and hacking interact with one another, and how those things are used. There's some very interesting sort of patterns that come out. And when you dissect it a little bit more and you look at, say, activists and compare it to organized crime, or look at, more, nation-state sort of actors, they have different types of attacks that they use, and they have different victims most of the time as well. So it's very interesting when you start collecting this data, even if you do it within your own organization, you get part of some sort of intelligence or information sharing group, to be able to look at this, you get a much bigger story. There's a lot of depth to this when you start using it.
We've got a question up there. We're through all the slides, by the way.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about collecting event data. It's important when you're looking at frequency of event data to make sure that you're kind of comparing like to like.
Yep.
How do you describe or encourage consistency around the atomic level of an event?
This is probably, I'll admit that this is a difficult question, especially we've kind of expanded this, right? We had the same question just internally when we were analyzing our own data, and well, what do we call an incident, right? And because some incidents affect two different organizations, but it's tied together. So is that a separate incident to those separate organizations, or is it a mega incident or something like that? So these questions are hard, and basically we've gotten better at it over time, I guess is the best answer. But see, there's still an issue of, we get asked a lot for, could I do this with my device monitoring? You know, what on my events there, could I use this process? And I'll be honest and say most of the work we've done is on an incident that has happened that there's some kind of response to, but the principle can be applied to other types of incidents. But am I off track with your question?
No, I think that, yes. It's not off track.
It's okay.
I guess I'd like to follow up, because you mentioned using things like ticketing systems.
Right.
To help drive the data collection. So I was just thinking, if you were going to use, let's just do an example. If you had 6 laptops hit in the same day by the same drive-by download,
Right.
would you consider that one incident, which is associated with that one piece of malware affecting the system? Would you count by number of assets affected?
This is a really good question. There is a sort of time element involved with tying an incident together. And also, I know this is a drive-by download, so let's just say they got it all in one place. I mean, that's, so yes, there is a time piece. If they happened all the same day, like you said, that could be, I think, considered one incident. But it's, the same thing happens. We have this discussion all the time with skimming devices. I know it's a totally different subject, but we get these things from the Secret Service where they go out and investigate, and a bunch of ATMs and a bunch of different banks have all been skimmed. And so it's, okay, is an incident every separate bank? Is an incident every separate ATM? How do we handle this? So again, it's kind of trying to learn over time, and sometimes we go out and then we'll dial it back, and yeah, I'm busting that question pretty bad, but it's a problem, that those kind of fringe things, and that is going to be a barrier to information sharing, but maybe we get better ideas as we start spreading it out.
One quick thing, sorry, just to add to that. Sometimes if you kind of do this root cause analysis on like 6 drive-by downloads within your organization, you might be able to tie it back to to like a single event that started it all.
Yeah.
So for instance, if it was an email, like spam that came in that was direct, so this would be some sort of social engineering, external social kind of thing.
It would share the first segment.
If it
and
shared the
split
first
off from there.
segment, then at that point, we would probably consider that one incident that affected, 6 different people, because each of them had to click on that link and go visit a website and get drive-by downloaded on their systems. But and then there would be 6 separate, desktop assets or laptop assets that were involved. But doing that sort of exercise when you're kind of doing the lessons learned and kind of understanding what happened is very helpful in determining that.
What did you mean by atomic level? You kind of answered the question, which was how have you handled this kind of frequency issue up until now? So you get a good example right there.
So the question is, what is the atomic level? We're not physicists, though, right?
Well, I mean, maybe not. So what I meant by atomic level is essentially that grid is displaying counts of something. So if you kind of need to count like things. So in my experience, you can count things like transactions, packets, login events, and that would be an event that I would consider an atomic level. Logins, transactions, requests, packets, malware,
All right.
I think we have one more. Okay, one question, last.
When it comes to Veris, it looks like it's very simple, kind of, I don't want to say watered down, but tip of the iceberg just to ease people into this kind of level. Do you guys have a more complicated set beneath it?
So, yes. Veris is kind of a balance between, you could count innumerable, you could never run out of counting things about an incident, right? So it is a balance between, we're trying to capture, Veris really has this decision-making thing. We want to capture what is useful for decision-making, is kind of the driver behind it, as opposed to, say, like a malware analyst would probably find a lot of things missing from Veris if they really, 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 really wanted to drill down into malware. About malware, we want to know its main functionality and the vector of its, the way it got there, and then some other things like hash and things that could be used to detect it. So, but going back to your other question, yes, we kind of have Veris community, we call it, which is what we've put out as, hey, this is the minimum set we think the community can use and get a good start on information sharing. And then internally, we collect other data points that we use and track.
You know what RDF is, right?
RDF? RTF.
RD, Resource Descriptor Framework.
Okay,
Considered
right.
computing stuff.
Okay.
Considered making a version that fits into that. One of the problems with it is it's still not quite machine passable. You know what I mean? It's getting there, but you get to like RDF stuff, and you can start building up other ontologies to put this into.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of work in the last several months. It's way overdue, but we've got a schema now that's XML is what we went with to start for. Veris has been kind of in a wiki, which is not the easiest way to use it, but so we're moving toward that. What is needed to share these things in large quantities when we start to lose control over who's putting in information.
All right, thank you, guys.
Before we leave,